Thanks. So I'm a PhD student, but probably not for much longer. My defense is next week. So thanks for this opportunity so I can share my research and see what you guys think about it. So my field is in social psychology, and in social psychology we talk a lot about how humans are social animals. We need to affiliate with others, and this is something that we need in our lives, and it's important for survival and thriving. So something that's really important for social networks and having a good social life is having a good reputation. If people don't like you, it's going to be really hard to have a good social life. So a question that I want to start with is, what matters most for a good reputation? So research going all the way back to the 1960s shows that something that matters a lot is interpersonal warmth. So things like being good-natured, sociable, or friendly. If people have these traits, people tend to like them, and social connections tend to come really naturally. Then there's also factors that relate to competence, so things like being intelligent, creative, or skilled. But what past research has shown matters more than these things are traits like honesty, fairness, or loyalty, traits of morality. So this is pretty easy to understand. It's pretty intuitive. It's best to be high in all three, but we don't like people who are dishonest even if they're friendly, and we don't like people who are prejudiced even if they're intelligent. So it seems like when it comes to reputation, morality is what matters the most. So just to define morality a little bit more, and I don't think this is too controversial, when we talk about morality, I think of it as being pro-social. So by that we mean that moral actions are things that are positive, helpful, and promoting of social acceptance and friendship. So this is a pretty simple and obvious model, and when we think about the relationship between morality and reputation, we expect that really well-liked people are people who would also be very pro-social, and you can think of a lot of examples that support this. This isn't the full story, though. We can think of examples where there are individuals who seem to gain popularity not just in spite of antisocial behavior, but at times because of it. So for instance, Donald Trump's rise in popularity happened during the 2016 primary debates, and he got famous really initially for insulting his own party, breaking a bunch of social norms, insulting fellow candidates, just doing things that were pretty wildly antisocial. And it seemed not to hurt his popularity, but actually to help it. You might think that this is a certain type of insanity for the political right in America, but the same year on the other side in the Democrats, another Democrat rose to popularity by doing not exactly the same thing, but doing some social norm breaking of her own. So this is Tulsi Gabbard. She became famous when she called out the Democratic National Committee over their handling of the debates, and she resigned her position and basically burned bridges with the whole organization. And this is something that gained her support even within the own Democratic Party. So burning bridges with the Democrats themselves was something that actually gained her support from Democrats. And then outside of the domain of politics, that same year, the infamous but still popular Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson initially became famous when he posted a YouTube video that was criticizing political correctness and gender issues. So Wired calls this a lightning rod of controversy. It was something where it became famous because some people reacted very negatively, some people reacted very positively. And this is kind of what made him a much more common name. So these people all gained popularity and fame from doing things that are negative and divisive. So things that are ultimately antisocial. So it seems like people can also gain reputation by being antisocial. So to define this a little bit more, by this I mean contrary to the laws and customs of society in a way that causes annoyance and disapproval of others. So I think you can agree that the behaviors that I've described fit pretty well into this definition. So this seems to directly contradict the findings in person perception that I covered before. Previous research was pretty clear that being seen as moral is really key in gaining and maintaining a good reputation. So how do you explain these things? So I'd like to present a model that we call the burning bridges model. So burning bridges is a phrase that we can hear sometimes in like a colloquial social setting. For instance, if somebody leaves a job in a very aggressive way, you could say that they burn bridges with that job. It's something where they've sabotaged that relationship and they're not able to go back. So to explain this model, I think it's worth talking about the origin of this expression, and it actually goes back a pretty long way. So it dates back to the ancient Chinese general Sun Tzu, who wrote in The Art of War that when your army has crossed the border into enemy territory, you should burn your boats and bridges in order to make it clear to everybody that you have no desire for retreat. So Sun Tzu meant this in the specific context of warfare, but I want to argue today that this kind of signaling strategy can apply to really any kind of intergroup conflict. The way that people use this expression today can apply to a lot of different contexts as well. So I think this can extend to things like politics, culture, or even petty debates over sports teams. Anything where there is strong intergroup conflict, this principle can apply. So Sun Tzu presents burning bridges as a costly signal, and he treats it like it's acting like a commitment device, and this is a term from psychology and economics. So commitment devices are things like New Year's resolutions or long-term savings plans where it's very easy to put money in, but much more difficult to take money out. Even marriage is a kind of commitment device. These are all arrangements that people can enter into that are very costly, and people do it to help them achieve a difficult goal, to kind of commit them to some course of action. So Sun Tzu tells the reader to destroy his own avenue of retreat, and this is a way that signals to everybody. This is something that's important that we'll come to later. So this is key because it should signal to both the enemy army and to the general's own army themselves that they have no option but to commit to attack. So this idea of burning bridges as a social signal, we're not the first to think of it. It was described initially by Hugo Mercier, but we're the first to give it kind of a strict operational definition and to provide, as I'll show, some actual empirical evidence to support it. So this is our definition. So burning bridges is a social strategy that can be done consciously or unconsciously, in which an individual intentionally and transparently sacrifices a potential relationship with one group in order to credibly signal commitment to a rival group. So we also theorize that there are some conditions in which this will be very effective. So we think this works best when groups have really strict separations, or there's an impermeable relationship between the two groups. So this means that people can really only belong to one group or the other, and there's not a lot of movement between the groups. They're very strictly separated. Another thing that makes this most effective is if somebody's reputation is in question. So if somebody's already really high status within a group, burning bridges with outside groups is probably not going to do a lot to reinforce their reputation. It's most effective when people don't have a prior reputation or their reputation is somehow in question. So this is our model. How do we go about in testing it empirically? So we wanted to see if burning bridges is actually a good strategy to signal commitment for one group over another. So we created a hypothetical story about two groups in conflict, and we tested people's perception of burning bridges as a signal of commitment. So if burning bridges is an effective strategy, people should perceive someone who burns their bridges as being more committed compared to someone who does not. So for our first study, we recruited 242 participants from the US on the online survey platform Prolific. And we told them a story about a gang member who was just finishing his prison sentence. And the gang member says that he wants to quit his gang and work for the police to help bring his old gang to justice. So rightfully, when the police hear this, they're somewhat suspicious of him. They don't know if he's really committed to it, if he's maybe being an undercover agent or something. They have reason to doubt the truth of his intentions and to doubt his commitment. So each participant got one of two versions of this story. Actually, there's three, but I'll tell you about the third one later. So the gang member, his name is George. He's caught between two groups, the police and his old gang, and he wants to prove his honest commitment to one group over the other. And he wants to do it in a way that's believable and trustworthy. In the open bridges condition, he says that he wants to work with police, so he's very clear about his claims. But the gang was his family and it was his whole life, and he's hesitant to sever all those connections. He does want to leave the gang, but he also wants to move back to his old city and maintain contact with his old friends and family who are tied with the gang. So this is somebody who's keeping his bridges open. He allows himself this avenue of retreat. He says he won't take it, but it's still there. And I want to point out that this is actually something that's pro-social. He's maintaining social connections here. He's trying to please both groups. So in the burning bridges condition, it's the same thing. He says that he's committed to working with police, and he's given the option of maintaining contact with his old gang, but he refuses. He declares that he's left the gang. He tells this to everybody, and he severs contact. He even moves to a new city and cuts off all contact with his old friends and family who were in the gang. So this is burning bridges, and it makes it so returning to the gang later would be next to impossible. So he's severing a genuine social connection here with his old friends and family, which is actually an antisocial action. So this is a summary of our conditions. The things that we asked, first we wanted to see if people actually believed that his bridges were burned. This is kind of like our manipulation check question. We just want to be sure that people are actually understanding the story in a way that we expect them to. A key thing we want to look at is how people perceive how committed he is to actually working with the police. Do they actually see him as committed to leaving the gang? And then looking at his future behavior, do they actually trust him to hold a job on the police force? So this is what we found. So this is a measure of perception of his difficulty to return to the gang. So this is on the y-axis. So higher ratings mean that they perceive it as more difficult. And on the x-axis, we have our two conditions. We have the burning bridges condition and the open bridges condition. So each dot is one person's answer. And so we see that there's actually a really strict separation here. This isn't scaled. This is the full scale. So people are actually very clear on the bridge burner. It makes it really difficult to return to the gang, but the person who leaves his bridges open, it's definitely a possibility for him. So this tells us that people are really understanding the vignette in the way that we expect them to. So then we looked at perceptions of how committed they think George is to leaving the gang. So again, we have the burning bridges condition and the open bridges condition. And so here we see the same thing. So they perceive more commitment to the person who burned his bridges compared to the person who left his bridges open. So you can actually see the participants saw this as 0 to 10, so the midpoint here is actually around 5. So notice in open bridges, there's a lot of disagreement. People kind of don't know what to make of it. There are some people in the middle, but some people think he's really committed, and around the same people think that he's not committed at all. But when you look at the bridge burner, everybody really agrees that he's on the side of commitment. And then when we look at whether he can be trusted to hold a job on the police force, the effects are slightly weaker, but we see the same pattern. So to summarize so far, people perceive the bridge burner as more committed and more trustworthy compared to somebody who leaves his bridges open. People also perceive the bridge burner as being unable to return to the gang, which is good. That's what we expect. And what this shows is that by being antisocial to one group, the bridge burner is credibly signaling his commitment to the other group. Now, there's actually two explanations for these effects, because there's actually two things happening when somebody burns their bridges. One is that the bridges are gone. So the bridge burner has no reliable way to betray the police in this situation. This allows us to reliably predict his future behavior. He can't cross a burned bridge. Another thing that happens is that the bridge burner proves that he means what he says. By burning his bridges, we get a convincing window into his intentions when he does this. So which matters more? Are people responding to the change in options or the signal of intent? So a way to tell this is to have a condition where intent is removed from the equation. So this is actually our third condition. So we call this the no bridges condition. This is one in which, in this version of the story, the gang member loses his ability to rejoin the gang unintentionally. So in this story, during this process, the word got out that he was working with police and the gang severed ties with him. So this is something that was out of his control and he didn't intend, but the resulting situation is the same as the burning bridges. So he didn't do this intentionally, but the result is the same. So this is our third condition, and we put it in the middle here. So this is the graph of ratings of commitment. So if the no bridges condition is the same as the open bridges condition, then we know that it's not the options that matter. It's that the bridge burner chose to reduce his options that matters. But if it's the same as the burning bridges condition, then it's the fact that he himself burned them that matters. People are really focusing on his intent. And what matters less is that there's no other options involved. So this is what we found. It's actually significantly in between. Yeah, so what do we make of this? Well, it's probably that both matter. So you get a step up when you change the incentive structure, even if you didn't do it intentionally. We can trust this person to do it just because that's all that he can do. But if the person chose to do it himself, we know that he did it intentionally, and we get a window into his own intentions, and that gives a slight boost as well. So it seems like both things actually matter. And when we look at trust, so how much they trust him to stay on the police force, we see about the same thing. These two are actually not significantly different. So you can see that there is a slight difference here. It's hard to know what to make of this. It might be that we just don't have a large sample size. It could also be that since this item is about predicting future behavior, intent doesn't matter because if there's no bridges, he only has one option. So it might just be that intentions don't matter here because you're just looking at, well, what is he going to do? Well, he can only do one thing in the no bridges condition, and so that's what matters.
So there's a significant difference in the trust between no bridges and open bridges, right?
Between these two, yes. So there is a significant difference here, but not a significant difference here. Yeah, good point. Okay, so two things matter to perceptions of commitment: intent and options available. And it seems like both of these matter for commitment, but maybe not so much for trust or looking at future behavior. So this suggests that when judging behavior, all that matters is the person's situation and what they have the power to do. It doesn't matter whether they put themselves in that situation or whether they got there accidentally. So this gives us some empirical support to the burning bridges model. It does have limitations, though. One shortcoming is that participants are likely to empathize with police, but they're not likely to empathize with the gang. So we're kind of only seeing one side of the story. So Sun Tzu talked about burning bridges being a strong signal to everybody, not just the enemy army or his own army, but to both, meaning it should signal both the police and the gang alike. So another question is, does the group that's being left or abandoned also see the bridge burner as more committed? So this study actually can't answer this. One more thing. So another thing is that we think that burning bridges is a model that should apply to a lot of different domains, and this is just one situation. So maybe people just think this way about gangs and police. So we want to broaden this and look at different kinds of social conflicts and different kind of intergroup relations. So in a second study, we recruited 827 US prolific users, and we made a news story that described a situation in the Cold War in which the US government, or a worker from the US government, approached the Soviet Union and said that he wanted to sell them US nuclear secrets. So the Soviets take this information, but realistically, they're unsure whether they can trust it. They think that he could genuinely be a defector or he could be a misinformation agent. They don't really know what to make of this person. So this results in one of three outcomes that serve as our three conditions, similar to the prior study. So in the open bridges condition, after this deal is made, he returns home to the US, but he wants to keep contact open with the Soviets. He says, no, I want to keep working with you, but I'm just going to go back to the US. In the burning bridges condition, he says that he's committed and wants to keep working with the Soviets, and he actually renounces his US citizenship, making it impossible for him to return to the US. And then in the no bridges condition, the same kind of thing arises, but sort of by accident. So at this point, the relations between the US and the Soviet Union deteriorate, causing the borders to be closed, making it so that he can't return home to the US. And this is something that's outside of his control. So our conditions were as before, and we also measured perceptions of his commitment to defect. Do they think that he's really committed to helping this other country, or is he being dishonest? And we also measured how much the Soviets should trust the information. So we asked people to take the position of the Soviet Union and say, do you think this person is trustworthy? Is he giving genuine information, or do you think he's a spy or a misinformation agent? So we actually had another condition here, which adds some complication. And that's the same story again, but with the countries reversed. So in this one, a defector from the Soviet Union goes to the US and says that he wants to sell them Soviet nuclear secrets. So this allows us to see something new. We can now test participants' perception of somebody who leaves their own group to join a rival group, the US defector, and somebody who leaves their rival group to join their group, the Soviet defector. So if perceptions are symmetric, then Sun Tzu is right that burning bridges is a good signal to everybody, allies and rivals alike. So we actually have 6 conditions here. So we have 3 featuring the US defector and 3 featuring the Soviet defector. So this is why we have so many more participants in this study. Each participant only saw one version of this study. So this is what we found, and it's a bit crowded, but we can go through it. So this is ratings of how committed the defector is to helping the rival country. So we have the 2 groups here. In light gray is the US defector, so this is the American going to the Soviets. And then in the dark gray, we have the Soviet defector, so the opposite case. So just ignoring the groups, if we just look at the averages across these 2, we see that it's basically the same pattern as before. So people think that the person who burned their bridges is more committed than the person who had no bridges, and they're more committed than the person who had open bridges. So, yeah? Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'll talk about this in a minute. That's a good point. So this adds in a point where you can get the person's own perspective, but yeah, it's not perfect because we're asking them to take the perspective of somebody else. But we can see actually how good they are at doing that, and it turns out that there's some differences. They're not actually perfect. They're not perfectly symmetric at taking the perspective of the Soviets. So if you look at just the burning bridges condition, you see there's a difference between the 2 groups. So people think that the US defector, so the American traitor essentially, is more committed than the Soviet traitor coming to America. So why could this be? Well, there's kind of 2 explanations here. They could think that the person who goes over to the Soviet Union must be crazy, and they'd have to really believe it to do something so nuts, right? Yeah. The other thing is that if you're considering that, and you think, well, maybe he's a spy, maybe not. If he's a spy, well, that's fine for us. Let him spy on the Soviet Union. That's still a good outcome. The case is different if you're considering something that threatens your own country. So you look at the Soviet defector and you might be more suspicious. You might think, well, it's going to be bad if this person turns out to be a spy, and so people might be more hesitant to trust. And actually, if you look at trust, you can see the same kind of pattern. There's only a significant difference in the bridge burner compared to the others, which I'm not exactly sure why that is. Maybe it's because this one, I don't know. We can talk about why it might just be for the bridge burner here, but it's interesting that it's targeted to that one condition there. So we see the same pattern. It might just be that the US people think that you'd be crazy to think to leave the US. It's not really clear. All right, so the key finding here is that the burning bridges signal is actually different for the two groups. It's especially strong for the group that's being abandoned. So if the person's leaving our group, we really trust that person. But if somebody's coming to our group, we don't trust them as easily. So this is a bit symmetric. So it shows that this is a risky strategy. You're actually losing more than you gain in the economy of trust here. It makes sense if your new group is better than the old one and you have no reason to associate with the old one at all. But if you want to go back and collaborate or maybe return to the old group, the burning bridges strategy makes this basically impossible. So just to summarize, this model shows how antisocial behavior can boost reputation. So burning bridges works, but it's risky. So you definitely exit your old group, but you might only be adopted by your new group. They have reason to be suspicious of you. So you may make friends with this strategy, but you'll definitely make enemies. So we have a few future studies planned. A shortcoming of this is that we are initially inspired by the domain of politics, but we don't actually test it in the political domain. So we're currently working on that. There's also an idea by the author who kind of first suggested this in a theoretical sense, that fringe groups might rely on this kind of strategy to gain and recruit followers. So he gives the example of ISIS and flat earthers. So you might think they don't have a lot in common, but they're both very narrow, and professing loyalty to that group makes you really unpopular to basically everybody else in the world, right? So why would somebody do this? Well, it's actually a really good signal, right? If you come out in support of ISIS, well, that's going to make everybody hate you. And if we're ISIS, we say, okay, well, we can trust this guy. He has nowhere else to go. And they dislike you for moral reasons, but the flat earthers, it's kind of more like in intellectual reasons. If you profess flat earth, everybody will think you're nuts, but the flat earthers might think, well, we can really trust this guy. He made everybody else think he's stupid. So we're looking at testing that as well, but that might be a bit more difficult. Okay, so that's the end of this project. I have a second project that I want to talk about, and this also talks about intergroup conflict, but in a different kind of context, one that's a bit more extreme, and that's the context of war. So to talk about this, I think it's easiest to just start with an example. So say you're a fighter pilot patrolling northern Iraq in a region that's known to be controlled by ISIS militants. You identify an ISIS member on the ground. This man's dangerous. He's known for making chemical weapons. The soldier sees your jet overhead and takes shelter in a nearby farmhouse. But there's another person in the farmhouse too, an innocent civilian. Your jet is low on fuel and you must make a decision. Do you fire a missile on the building and kill both people inside, or do you return to base and allow both people to live? So people in the military are often called to make decisions like this, and they don't always choose wisely. Civilian casualties in wartime are sadly a really common occurrence, and right now we hear a lot about two large-scale armed conflicts in the world. And both of them, there's a lot of talk about the civilian cost of life. So in Gaza, there's international attention on the extreme humanitarian cost of the war. And before this, the world's attention was focused on the civilian death toll in Ukraine. So in both of these, it's unclear if civilians are deliberately being targeted or killed by mistake. But if we look at the Middle East, we can see that there are obvious mistakes being made. So in 2019, a drone strike that was intended for an ISIS hideout accidentally killed 30 innocent pine nut farmers in Afghanistan. And in 2021, a US airstrike that was thought to be on an ISIS agent instead killed a foreign aid worker and several children. So it seems like these are pretty egregious mistakes, but they seem to be somewhat commonplace in modern war. Why is this? So this project looks at a factor that we think may explain one reason why civilian casualties are actually so common, and it's a psychological reason. So the story I just told you, we told versions of to over 1,500 Americans through a mix of Amazon Mechanical Turk and the Prolific platforms. The version that you heard described a pilot who must choose whether to bomb a dangerous ISIS operative who makes chemical weapons if it would also mean killing an innocent bystander. So other people read different cases where the bystander was maybe not so innocent. So for instance, what if the bystander was a civilian who was a Muslim extremist who supported ISIS, or another ISIS soldier? Or what if you didn't know who that other person was? How would this change your answer to the question, should the pilot fire? So here are our findings. We presented people one of 7 different versions of the story, and we asked them the same question, should the pilot fire and kill both people, or return to base and allow both to live? They just answered yes or no. On the y-axis, we have the percent of people who endorsed the bombing from 0% to 100%. So up here is people who said yes, down here is people who said no. And then on the x-axis, we have the different kind of conditions. So we start with 2 kind of extremes. One is that the bystander is an ISIS soldier, so another combatant. And another one where they're an innocent goat farmer with no ties to ISIS at all. So we consider these kind of 2 extreme conditions, and we hope at least that people are sensitive to this distinction. And it turns out, thankfully, that they are. So around 75% of people say to bomb when it's an ISIS soldier, so essentially 2 combatants. So pretty high, but not 100%. And when it's an innocent civilian, around a quarter, 24% of people say that the pilot should bomb. So much lower, but again, not 0%. So it turns out that people do actually care about the identity of the bystander that would be killed in a military strike. This is a good start. So we wanted to look at in-between conditions. So these are ones where the bystander was innocent, but maybe not so unaffiliated with the enemy. So one was an extremist Muslim who's not part of ISIS, but he supports them ideologically. Another was a farmer who's also not part of ISIS, but he benefits financially from their takeover of the region. Another is a local Muslim who feels conflicted about ISIS, so he sees some pros and some cons about supporting them. And one is a Muslim who shares their religion, but rejects their ideology and actions. So with these cases of in-between involvement, we see that endorsing bombing also has kind of an in-between pattern. So we see an effect where more involvement and more guilt is associated with more comfort in endorsing bombing, and less guilt is associated with less favor of bombing. So this is all pretty predictable. It's pretty much what you would expect. But we also included another condition really just sort of as a control, and that's a bystander who is unidentified. And this we found had surprisingly high endorsement. So 58% of people here endorse the bombing, and this is significantly higher than all the other conditions except for the Muslim extremist. So essentially, it's on par with a person who is a ISIS supporter. So this was really surprising. So another key finding is that when bystanders are unidentified, people are more comfortable endorsing bombings that would result in collateral damage. So we wanted to know why people were doing this. Like, what are they thinking? So we asked them. We did a replication, and we asked them just in a free response to explain their reasoning for their choice. And people gave a few different kinds of reasoned answers. So it's easiest to break this down by whether they thought the pilot should not fire or the pilot should fire. So first, some people appeal to moral principles. So one person said that the pilot should not fire because it's unjust to kill. Another person said that the pilot should fire because it's for the greater good. A lot of people talked about it saving more lives in the long run. Some people admit uncertainty, but they hedge their bets one way or the other. So one person said the pilot should not fire because if you cannot confirm that the second person is a combatant or a terrorist, then you cannot fire upon a civilian. Some people hedge it in the other direction. They say the pilot should fire because the person might be a terrorist as well, and so it would be a good countermeasure. And then some people just make assumptions. So these are all stories about the unidentified bystander. So they have no information about this person. It says there's another person there. You don't know who that person is. Despite this, some people still make assumptions about who that person is. So one person said the pilot should not fire because it knowingly results in the death of an innocent, but they don't have this information or any context to suggest that. Another person said the pilot should fire because the second person is highly probable to be an ISIS contact, but again, they don't have any information to suggest that. So following this up, we wanted to know to what extent people were assuming who the bystander was when making this decision. So we asked them, do you think the unknown bystander is a combatant or a civilian? So we gave them this item, and we asked them to rate how likely it is from 1 to 100, from not at all likely to extremely likely. So here's what we found. The average answer that people gave for the unidentified bystander being a combatant was 58%. So you would expect if people were neutral, this to be around 50%, and this is actually significantly above that midpoint. And this gets really interesting when you look at people's judgments of whether the pilot should fire. So if you break it down by that, the people who think that the pilot should not bomb, and you look at their answers for what is the chance that the unknown bystander is part of ISIS, it's kind of normally distributed. So the big spike is at 50%. So a lot of people are saying, well, we don't really know, it's 50-50. And presumably as a result, they think, because we don't know, the pilot shouldn't bomb. But if you look instead at the people who think the pilot should bomb, and again, this is a slight majority of participants, we see the story is really different. So here, people are actually pretty sure that they're an ISIS combatant, and this, we think, is informing their choice of bombing. But they don't have any information one way or the other. People are just kind of coming to these assumptions on their own. So it seems like there's a tendency to assume that the unknown bystander is an enemy, even though there's no evidence. And this may be linked to being comfortable bombing people that are unknown. So why is this the case? So one possibility is that this is just pro-American bias. A limitation to this study is that we're asking Americans about a real-world conflict, and maybe they have really strong feelings towards their country and against their enemy. That's really reasonable. So if that's driving this effect, that's not a particularly interesting explanation. So we wanted to see if this was the case. So we ran a new study in which we took the same story and we replaced all the details with details from fictional countries. So we just said, hey, this is a work of fiction, make judgments about the situation. So we replaced Iraq and Syria with Serovia, we replaced ISIS with the Serovian Federation, and we replaced America with Namibia. So just countries that I made up. So if pro-American bias is driving this effect, then we expect to see reduced bombing endorsement, specifically of the unidentified bystander, with this fictional conflict condition. And so we ran again this real-world conflict condition that's the same as those first studies. So again, on the y-axis, we have the percent of people who said that the pilot should bomb. And what we see is that there's not really a difference here. You can see a slight drop, but it's not significantly different. We have other measures, too, where we asked the same question in a different way. We would ask them how acceptable is it for the pilot to bomb, and we asked them to judge it on a Likert scale. And we found that those were actually, not only were they not different, they were actually statistically the same. So it seems like, to our surprise, there's actually not a difference in considering the real world conflict and between just a hypothetical fictional world conflict. People make the same kind of judgments. So these findings may apply to judgments about war generally. So an issue you may have noticed is that I keep talking about Americans, which begs the questions, are Americans weird about this? So there's certainly a lot of stereotypes about Americans being really gung-ho when it comes to war, and so we wanted to actually test this. So we replicated this first study with a sample from the United Kingdom, and here's what we found. So this is data from US participants. This is from the old data. Each of these lines is where the average judgment was for the percent of people who endorsed the bombing. So notice that the unidentified bystander is a little bit above 50% here. So these are American participants, and when we look at UK participants, we see the story is pretty different. So there's lower endorsing of bombing overall, and especially in the unidentified bystander condition. Also, the unidentified bystander condition is not significantly different from any of the other conditions except for the ISIS soldier. So all of these are about the same, maybe just because they're near the bottom here. So to answer this question, are Americans weird about this? Yes. So it seems like US participants may be unique in their support for bombings, at least compared to the UK. So if Americans are unique in their attitude towards bombings, why? What's the explanation? Why are they different from people from the UK? So there's a concept called total war, and this is the idea that was popular during the Second World War, that you think about war as a struggle between two complete nations, and there's no distinction between civilians and combatants because you assume that all the civilians are helping towards the war effort. This is basically how the Second World War was conducted. So this is an attitude that people may hold, or they may see the kind of modern take where there's a strong separation between civilians and combatants. So we wanted to see if participants are just biased in the situations that we're testing, or whether they actually have a sort of explicit belief about war that's different across the US and the UK that we can capture by measuring their support of this concept. So I made a scale that addressed how much participants agreed with the ideas of total war. I think there were 11 items, and these are some of them. So they would say how much they agreed with statements like, during war, it's acceptable to bomb cities and other population centers in an enemy nation if it results in a crucial strategic advantage to help end the war. Or, in war, everything and anything is fair game. So we asked this of people in the UK and the US, and this is what we found. So these are just histograms, and on the x-axis here we have their support for total war. Higher values mean that they're more supportive of total war. So in the UK, it's fairly skewed towards the low end, and if we look at the US, we see a fairly different story. So here the mean is around 2, here the mean is around 3. So it seems like it's not just our specific scenario that we're looking at. It seems like Americans have a different attitude towards war generally. They're more comfortable with this idea of total war that doesn't separate civilians and combatants in terms of legitimate targets. And predictably, this is something that predicts their endorsement of bombing. So if you just look at, so this is whether they endorse the bombing. Up here is people who said yes. Down here is people who said no. Each dot is one person's answer. And then on the x-axis here, we have their support for total war. And we see predictably that people who are more supportive of total war are also more supportive of bombings in our stories. So it seems like total war might be something that's driving these differences between the US and the UK. So here are our findings just to sum up. And I'd like to add to them that unidentified bystanders in war tend to be treated guilty until proven innocent, just to kind of sum up the effects that we see. So just to summarize, I'll end with a decades-old policy that I think summarizes the effect that we found pretty clear. So this is something that, as far as I know, went into effect in 2012 during the Obama administration in the United States. And this was a new way of counting casualties that the US adopted, which, according to the New York Times, in effect counts all military-age males in a strike zone as combatants, unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent. So unfortunately, the stuff that we find essentially says that this is what people intuitively do. They treat people as guilty until proven innocent. And so we hope that by making people aware of this, we can remind decision makers to be a bit more careful when making important judgments like this. So I'd like to thank my supervisor, Andy Vonash, my co-supervisor, Kumar, and Paul Conway in University of Southampton for their assistance on this and other projects. Thank you all so much. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Scott, just
Nick.
fantastic set of studies.
Thank you.
Really good. I'm wondering, just to start at the beginning, with the definition of burning bridges, a couple things strike me about it as interesting. One is, I guess most of the time when I think of burning bridges, interpersonally, I think of it as like a thing that we're doing kind of for our own self-concept more than it is an identity. Like, especially when you talk about unintentional, right? Unintentional burning of bridges is often seen as, I don't know, to me, it seems like a thing that we're doing for ourselves, not necessarily as an affiliation tool. Well, as a re-affiliation tool, but more maybe to actually remove an in-group from ourselves.
Yeah, interesting. So
I really don't care what anybody thinks, right? I just want to remove that, in some ways to protect, right, self-esteem. And
yeah.
By burning it, my self-esteem improves, and I kind of don't care what others think. Is that?
Yeah.
So is it necessarily? I mean, we have to conceptualize it in a particular way.
Yeah.
Like all of this. But is that part of like older conceptions of it too? Or
I don't know. So this is something that there's actually not a lot of literature on this term, burning bridges. So Hugo Mercier, in I think it was 2021, talked about it in this book, and I couldn't find any old literature on it, which I was kind of surprised by. I think you're right that there is an element of like self-esteem and self-concept, and maybe when we see, you know, if you cut off an ex or cut off some bad friends or something, that there's a lot of other reasons to do that other than this sort of social signaling thing. Maybe you just don't want to be around with them anymore.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah.
So I think that's true, and I think maybe that's at least some of, maybe all of the way that people use it colloquially. It's just not the phenomena that we want to talk about.
No, 100%, yeah, and I think it's great to co-opt it for that. I guess the other question is who, and I'll stop and let other people talk, but who uses the term burning bridges? And I guess in my mind, like when the term gets used, it's always the people who haven't crossed, who are sort of left behind, right? The bridge has been burned, somebody has left, right? Kind of the point of view. I never really hear about it as somebody burned a bridge and now they're in my in-group. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you'd see like the Republicans would say, you know, or traditional Republicans would say Donald Trump burned bridges, right?
Yeah.
To dissociate, but you know, the forever Trumpers aren't saying like, oh, he burned all the bridges. I mean, they might agree.
Interesting.
With that, right? But it's not we say it about things moving away from us, not necessarily things moving.
Yeah. So there might be asymmetries in how people perceive it.
Cut ties, sure.
Cut ties,
I
yeah.
just love the analogy too, so I'm just trying to think of which way.
If someone was coming into your group, you would say, oh yeah,
They
they're
cut
cut
ties.
ties
Yep.
with that.
Right. Which is maybe more of an affiliation thing rather than the burning bridges. But I get it and I love it.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. I think our data actually backs that up. So we see this here where the signal is strongest for the people being left. So that might be true. So it might be true that you think of burning bridges and talk about burning bridges more if you're the person who got abandoned, and the person who got a friend as a result of it, maybe they just don't notice it. So that's something that our data might support.
And I guess we also use it, not to, do we use it about people we liked, or are we actually quite happy they've
Interesting.
And we're like, oh yeah, they burned all the bridges. But I don't know about that either. But again, I love,
Yeah.
interesting ways.
It would be interesting to do some kind of study to see how people actually use this in language. Like you just kind of maybe describe a vague situation, use the term, and say, hey, how do you interpret this situation? And see if there's symmetries in how people think about it or use the term. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah?
Is there an effect of like bombing bridges? So if I'm trying to like sever ties with someone, like a group, to get into another group, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to like absolutely demolish, like, I don't know, if I'm a Soviet, I'm gonna kill some other Soviets, and then go off to the US, people in the US can be like, whoa, that guy's crazy,
Yeah.
no way we're trusting him.
Yeah, so we're interested in this too. So it might be that maybe burning bridges is like too strong of a signal. I was trying to think of other cases in politics because I use American examples here, but maybe you guys know, but there was a case recently of a like New Zealand government worker who got in trouble for saying something about it was against white people, and she was like she's on the in kind of I think the Labour or the Green Party. But she essentially said something that was very divisive, and it didn't work out for her. Like, it was really unpopular. So I think that's an example of, like, failing to burn bridges, or, like, burning them too hard, such that the signal actually becomes like, oh, you're just a really antisocial person, It could be that if you do it in a way that's too aggressive, it doesn't work. That's interesting if you could take it too far, like if the signal kind of gets diluted or maybe it flips. But, yeah, I like the idea. And I think it is something that's a risky strategy, and that's another way that it could be risky. If you make yourself too unappealing. Yeah. Yeah?
Two questions. One could be quite amateur to me, but with the definition, did it say that it needs to be intentional but could also be unconscious? That was one thing that...
Ooh, that's a good point.
Sure about. And then the other thing I wondered with, super interesting with the military aspect, and you getting data from I guess mostly civilians with their platform. I'm wondering whether or not if you did the same test with like military personnel from the US and the UK, whether or not that would signal kind of behaviours even within the military, and if those have worked out.
Yes. So we're interested in doing this. I'll answer your second question first. So that's a really good point. Is a problem in our study is we say, oh, there's these things going on in the world where the military is doing all these bad things. Let's study it by asking a bunch of people who are not in the military, right? That's a problem in the study. So we asked if people had military experience when we did the study, and we were interested in looking, is there a difference? A problem is that we just got so few people that we couldn't get a reliable sample, but we looked at the people that we did get, and we looked at people who were not in the military but had ties to the military, so their friends and family had been in the military or whatever, to see if there was a difference there. And those people were actually showed higher rates of bombing and showed an unidentified bystander bombing effect more than people who weren't associated with the military at all. So that's kind of circumstantial, but that's something that we want to look at is to people who make these actual decisions who are actually trained, are they different than lay people? Did they have the same kind of lay intuition, or is there something about their training and their environment that makes that different? Remind me of your first question again.
It might just be my lack of understanding. So it says a social strategy done consciously or unconsciously, but then it also says that the individual has to have intentionality. So I was just trying to understand
Yes.
how you can intentionally...
That's a good point. So maybe the terms are not perfect here. So by intentional, I want to separate it from that the no bridges condition. It has to be something that the person does. So could you do something intentionally, unconsciously? I don't know. I'll have to think about this. Maybe the terms could be better. But we want to separate it from people who are just put in that situation and they have no power at all. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the unconscious part is a bit bold. That's a good question. Yeah.
So with the burning bridges, when you're considering the one group whose bridges have been burned with an individual, does it then depend on if the other group, if there's multiple groups or just one?
Right.
And if there's differences?
So this is a good point. A lot of the stuff that I'm talking about is where there's two salient groups that are really impermeable, right? So politics is a good thing where there's one side and then you go to the other side. I think it works too if you have multiple other groups. So the stuff with flat earthers, for instance, that's a different model where they're not burning groups to I don't know, physicists or astronomers or something. They're burning groups to everybody. And so now it's everybody against this one group. So I think, yeah, the idea of burning bridges to multiple groups can happen too. It gets a lot more complex, but I'm interested in studying something like that. Yeah, does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Listen.
Amazing work, Scott.
Thank you.
I quite like it simply because we have faced civilian casualties in Afghanistan. And
thank you.
What I would ask, or maybe comment here, is that those who actually are fighter jets, running those fighter jets or pilots of fighter jets, they have a different attitude. We have seen, for example, quotes or heard quotes in the news that, hey, when Prince Harry was in Afghanistan, he said that for us it was like playing a video game, like
Wow.
killing people on the ground. That's news, and I think that will be the perception of people who are. So I think those who are actually doing the war, their attitudes will be different from the people who are, who
Yeah.
responding to these questionnaires. Anyways, that's just a comment. But I had a question about your first study where you talk about gang affiliation.
Mhm.
Now, I remember you mentioned something in terms of empathy towards police or something like that, where
Mhm.
people have more trust in police, or
Yeah, so
so my question here will be, do you have any attributes of the participants of the study? Because looking at what happens in the US, different states, there's no pro and anti-police, and with Black Lives Matter and these movements.
yeah.
How do you think that will factor into?
That's a really good point. Yeah, because participants could be really pro, really anti-police,
Yeah,
and that
so-
could
so
color
what
their
are your
judgment.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, we didn't think about that to measure it, so we don't have that data, unfortunately. So I think this is something that we want to test moving forward to really get people's viewpoints on these kind of intergroup relations. Because even we wanted to pick something really obvious, where we're like, okay, where is there good guys and bad guys? Okay, gangs and police. But even with that, you can still have divisive group memberships. So yeah, that's a good question, and I think that's something that's worth looking at. We want to do this thing with politics where we actually get people who are, report that they're in one side of they're in one team essentially, and they get their judgments across these kind of team lines to really separate that. But yeah, I think it speaks to how, divisive and groupish people can be, that it's hard to pick something where there's really only one side, or there's really no group divisions there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Really interesting studies. Thanks for your presentation.
Thank you.
I really liked the graphics too. Can I get your barcode? Really cool. I was just wondering, so in the bombing study, so in the fictional thing, do you think people were just replacing the fictional countries with US?
Yeah, we suspected that because there's like trade-offs, right? Because we want to make something that's comparable to the other thing, but if we change it, if we change it too much, then maybe it's just going to be different for other reasons. So
We flipped it around and it was actually an ISIS combatant versus an US military, potentially. Or
Interesting.
if you looked at, for instance, Ukraine aggression against Russia and then Russia aggression against Ukraine, you might
Yeah.
tease apart. Because I was wondering how much of it is just, people are considering how much is this for the greater good, right? So
Mhm.
how justified is it in even targeting that ISIS militant to begin with? Like
Yeah.
how many lives are you saving doing that? And
Yeah.
that's kind of balanced against the bystander?
yeah, this is really interesting. This is stuff that we want to do too. This idea of taking the different perspectives. I think something that kind of matters is maybe how much perceived threat there is, because it seems like this trade-off matters a lot. We did this study initially in the first data was collected all the way back in 2016 before I started, but we did follow-up studies in 2020, 2021 where ISIS was still somewhat relevant. Now they're not really threatening at all. So the landscape of things has kind of changed, and it seems like people are more willing to make moral sacrifices if the situation seems really desperate or there's a lot of threat. If you just say, oh, here's this has-been terrorist organization that doesn't really pose a threat, should we kill a bunch of civilians to get one of their guys? Probably not,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Just wondering about the bombing study.
Mhm.
Like you say, the unidentified bystander. What was the context given? Where were they? Were they at home or in a secluded
Yeah.
area where you would find militants, and then this one person is there in the middle of the desert?
Yeah.
Probably,
Yeah, this is a good point about the context, is people might be reading context clues into stuff. Because if you don't have any information, what do you do? Well, you look for information that could be maybe circumstantial. So the actual details are that, so they see the ISIS person that they identify, and then he runs down the road into a farmhouse, and that there's another person there who's at the farmhouse, and it simply says you don't know who that person is. So the idea is to create something that's as ambiguous as possible, but a lot of people, I think, said that, oh, well, he's near the ISIS person, so he's probably one of the ISIS members himself. And even some of the reviewers who have looked at this said that, well, maybe that's circumstantial evidence. Maybe there's not zero evidence that they're associated with ISIS. Maybe just being around them is somehow evidence as well. So we tried to manipulate this in a study where we had versions of it where it's like, we show them like a satellite photo of a building, and I photoshopped out like, so there's like a apartment duplex or something that's kind of in like the middle of a field. And there's like two houses, right, and there's a wall between them. And so in one, we describe, okay, there's a person in this house, and then there's a person in this house. And there's like a physical wall separating them. And we wanted to see if that would make people less likely to bomb, is if I went into Photoshop and I just erased the wall and said, okay, this is one building, so they're in the same house. It didn't really work. We think maybe the manipulation was too sensitive. People didn't really pick up on the differences. But this is something we're interested in too, is like what sorts of context clues can people get and read into and think, okay, well, because of that, that tells us this. What is the real chance of somebody being an ISIS militant in, a random place like this? People might have different presuppositions about that. They might think, oh, well, they're all a bunch of terrorists there, or they might think, oh, they're like a huge minority and it's mostly civilians. So it gets really difficult to make a truly ambiguous situation here. So this is something we're trying to do.
I'm also wondering, sorry. So bombing in military situations, these are all very, extreme cases that a lot of us can't really relate to. I'm wondering, like, if you can, like, sort of lower it down, tone down the volume and use it, the same kind of concept in the social media. So say, for example, the flat earthers who don't want to, maybe who are secretly positive flat earthers who don't want to reveal themselves, and like give them situations where they can burn bridges by revealing themselves and making comments and sorry, I'm just rambling here, but take that concept and use it, like, because all like the hatred and vitriol we see in social media is also similar kind of violence, but not.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because you see a lot of like scapegoating or dog piles on. Well, maybe there's somebody who says something that's ambiguous as to whether it's actually objectionable or hateful, and then people say, oh, this person's terrible. Like somebody will make a joke and it's unclear whether the joke is actually really racist or whether it's a joke. And then you get these big like social media mobs that, essentially punish them, and yeah, that's a type of harm as well. We started with kind of bombings because we were really kind of inspired by the trolley dilemma, because this is something about like, okay, it's really obvious if you do this, these people will die. If you do this, these people will die. So we wanted to kind of extend that to a real-world circumstance. We're interested too in maybe doing this with something like police too, to take out that kind of intergroup or international conflict and see if police choosing if somebody's a criminal or like an innocent person, if the same kind of decision-making works. But yeah, I'm interested in these other types of harm maybe people could have if there's like social harm that you get from something like social media. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah?
This is more of a personal question, which you don't have to answer.
Mm-hmm.
But you said you're defending your PhD
Yes.
next week. Any plans for after? Will this research be?
Also, I'm teaching another course here, so I'll be around at least until the end of 2024. So I plan to work on this more. So right now, the burning bridges stuff is the thing that I'm working on most, because we have kind of a clear idea of doing the politics thing. I'm interested in doing something with the bombing study. I don't know if it'd be possible, but I like the idea of putting people in like a VR headset and actually putting them in the situation where they have to press the button. If you guys know anybody who does studies like that, let me know. I think that'd be really awesome.
We have time for one more really quick question.
Yeah.
If an honors student wanted to take your course next semester, what would they do?
It's a course on the psychology of wisdom. So I'll be talking about empirical science of what is wisdom, how do we measure it, how do we teach it, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.